The morning sun was already burning hot when Jake Morrison rode into Deadwood Creek, his horse covered in dust and sweat. The animal looked as tired as Jake felt, and that was saying something. Jake hadn't slept well in days, not since he'd lost his last few coins in a poker game 3 towns back. His stomach growled loud enough to wake the dead, and his water bottle had been empty since yesterday afternoon. Jake was the kind of man people noticed for all the wrong reasons. He had shifty eyes that never looked straight at anyone, and his hands always seemed to be shaking just a little bit. Folks in these parts had a name for men like Jake, and it wasn't a nice one. They called him Yellow Morrison, though never to his face. Not because they were scared of him, mind you, but because even the toughest cowboys felt a little sorry for a man who'd fallen so far from what a cowboy was supposed to be. See, Jake had started out like most young men in the territory. He'd learned to ride before he could properly walk, could rope a steer with the best of them, and wasn't afraid of hard work. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Maybe it was the time he'd backed down from a fight with a smaller man over a card game. Or maybe it was when he'd run away from a cattle stampede, leaving his fellow cowboys to handle the danger alone. Whatever started it, Jake's reputation had been sliding downhill for years now. The thing about reputations in the Old West was they stuck to a man like tar. Once word got around that you couldn't be trusted in a tight spot, finding work became near impossible. Ranch owners wanted cowboys they could count on, not ones who might leave their cattle to die or their partners to face danger alone. So Jake had been drifting from town to town, picking up odd jobs here and there, but never staying anywhere long enough for folks to really get to know him. Which was probably for the best. As Jake rode down the main street of Deadwood Creek, he could feel eyes on him. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were always noticed. The buildings were typical for a cattle town, wooden structures with false fronts trying to look bigger than they were. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith, the hotel, and the bank all lined up in a neat row like soldiers. Hitching posts stood in front of each building, some occupied by horses whose owners were conducting business inside. Jake pulled his horse to a stop outside Murphy's saloon and dismounted slowly. His legs felt stiff from too many hours in the saddle, and his boots hit the wooden sidewalk with a hollow thump. Through the saloon's batwing doors he could hear the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. The smell of whiskey and tobacco drifted out, making Jake's mouth water. He hadn't had a proper drink in days, but the few coins in his pocket were barely enough for a meal, let alone liquor. That's when Jake noticed the commotion outside the bank. A small crowd had gathered, and folks were talking in excited whispers. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, so he wandered over to see what all the fuss was about. What he saw made his eyes widen and his pulse quicken. Standing in the center of the crowd was Samuel McKinnon, and even if Jake had never seen him before, he would have known this was someone important. McKinnon was a big man, not just in height, but in the way he carried himself. He had the kind of presence that made people naturally step aside and listen when he spoke. His hair was more gray than brown now, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against the prairie sun. But there was strength in those shoulders and wisdom in those eyes that made it clear this wasn't a man to be taken lightly. What really caught Jake's attention, though, was the thick roll of bills McKinnon was counting. The rancher had just come out of the bank, and from what Jake could overhear, he'd just completed a big cattle sale. The kind of sale that put serious money in a man's pocket. Jake's stomach clenched with hunger and want as he watched McKinnon carefully count the bills before tucking them into his vest pocket. "Must be nice," Jake muttered to himself, but loud enough that a few people nearby heard him. An older woman with kind eyes turned to look at Jake. "That's Sam McKinnon," she said, as if the name should mean something. "Just sold off 200 head of prime beef cattle to buyers from back east. Been working that herd for near 6 months, he has." Jake nodded and tried to look interested, but all he could think about was that roll of money. In his current state, it might as well have been a fortune. Enough to buy a proper meal, a warm bed, maybe even a bottle of decent whiskey. Enough to get him to the next town where nobody knew his name or reputation. "Sam's one of the good ones," continued another bystander, an elderly man with a white beard. "Built his ranch up from nothing, treats his workers fair, always pays his debts on time. His boy Thomas is cut from the same cloth, though maybe a bit harder around the edges." Jake filed that information away but kept his focus on McKinnon. The rancher was shaking hands with various townspeople, clearly well-respected and well-liked. Children ran up to him and he'd ruffle their hair or give them a penny for candy. It was the kind of scene that would have warmed most hearts, but Jake only saw opportunity as the crowd began to disperse. McKinnon started walking toward his horse, which was tied up outside the general store. Jake found himself following at a distance, his mind racing. The rancher was alone now, moving slowly like a man who'd had a long day and was looking forward to getting home. His steps were measured and careful, the way older men walked when they were trying not to show how tired they really were. Jake's hands were trembling now, but not from nerves exactly. It was more like hunger or desperation, or maybe both. He'd been living on the edge for so long that the sight of easy money was almost more than he could stand. His rational mind tried to warn him that this was a bad idea, that McKinnon wasn't the kind of man you wanted to cross. But desperation has a way of drowning out rational thinking. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Most folks had gone about their business, leaving the main thoroughfare quieter than it had been earlier. McKinnon reached his horse and started untying the reins, his back turned to the street. He was humming quietly to himself, probably thinking about getting home to his ranch and family. Jake took a deep breath and started walking toward the rancher, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in town could hear it. But there was nobody left to hear anything. Just Jake, McKinnon, and the decision that was about to change both their lives forever. Jake's boots made soft sounds on the wooden sidewalk as he approached Samuel McKinnon. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was walking through thick mud. His mouth had gone dry, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cooling afternoon air. The rational part of his brain kept screaming at him to turn around, to walk away, to find some other solution to his problems. But hunger and desperation have a way of making a man deaf to reason. McKinnon was taking his time with his horse, checking the saddle straps and adjusting the stirrups like a man who'd been riding long enough to know that details mattered. His movements were careful and practiced, the way they get when you've been doing something for decades. He seemed completely unaware that Jake was approaching, lost in his own thoughts about the successful day he'd had and the ride home that lay ahead. "Excuse me, mister," Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Excuse me, sir, could I have a word?" McKinnon turned around slowly, his weathered face showing mild curiosity rather than concern. Up close, Jake could see that the rancher was even more impressive than he'd appeared from a distance. The man had hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak and shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. But there was kindness in his eyes, the sort that came from years of dealing fairly with people. "Of course, son," McKinnon said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd never had reason to fear a stranger. "What can I do for you?" Jake's plan, such as it was, had been to ask for work. It seemed like the natural thing to do. A drifting cowboy approaching a successful rancher for employment. But now that he was face to face with McKinnon, the words seemed to stick in his throat. This wasn't just any rancher. This was clearly a man of substance, someone who would ask questions, check references, want to know about Jake's background and experience. "Well, sir," Jake began, fidgeting with his hat, "I was wondering if you might have any work available at your ranch. I'm handy with horses, and I can rope and brand with the best of them." McKinnon studied Jake for a moment, taking in the worn clothes, the nervous manner, and the general appearance of a man who'd been on hard times for a while. But there wasn't judgment in his gaze, just the careful assessment of someone who'd hired a lot of cowboys over the years and knew how to read men. "I appreciate you asking," McKinnon said finally, "but I'm afraid I'm fully staffed right now. Just finished a big sale, as you probably heard, but that means I'll be reducing my Crew for the winter months, not adding to it. He paused, seeming to consider something. But if you're really in need of work, you might try the Miller place about 10 miles north of here. Last I heard, they were looking for someone to help with their winter preparations. The kindness in Mick Kinnon's voice and the genuine helpfulness of his suggestion should have made Jake feel ashamed of what he was thinking. A decent man would have thanked McKinnon for the tip and ridden north to the Miller place. But desperation had already poisoned Jake's thinking, and all he could focus on was that roll of bills in Mick Kinnon's vest pocket. Much obliged for the suggestion, Jake said, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he stepped closer, pretending to pat his horse's neck. That's a fine animal you've got there. Looks like she's served you well over the years. McKinnon smiled with obvious pride. That she has? Bought her as a filly 15 years ago, and she's never let me down. Smart as a whip and sure-footed. As a mountain goat. He reached out to stroke the horse's muzzle. Don't know what I'll do when she finally decides to retire. As McKinnon turned his attention to the horse, Jake saw his chance. The rancher's back was partially turned, his focus. Elsewhere, his guard completely down. It was the kind of moment that Jake's cowardly nature had been waiting for. In a fair fight, Jake knew he wouldn't stand a chance against a man like McKinnon. But this wouldn't be a fair fight. Jake's hand moved to the heavy leather belt around his waist. Not for his gun, even he wasn't desperate enough for that. But there was a moment when everything seemed to slow down. He could hear his own heartbeat, could smell the dust in the air, could feel the late afternoon sun on his back. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking, and children were playing in front of the schoolhouse. You know, McKinnon was saying, still focused on his horse, if you do head up to the Miller place, tell old Pete that Sam McKinnon sent you. That might help your chances of getting hired. The genuine kindness in those words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Here was a man who just politely turned him down for work, but was still trying to help him find employment elsewhere. Most people would have told a drifter like Jake to move along and not thought about him again. But McKinnon was different. For just a moment, Jake hesitated. His better nature tried one last time to make itself heard. But then his stomach cramped with hunger, and the image of that roll of bills burned bright in his mind. His hand moved. Before his conscience could stop it, the blow caught McKinnon completely by surprise. Jake's fist connected with the back of the older man's head, sending him stumbling forward against his horse. The animal snorted and sidestepped nervously as McKinnon fought to keep his balance, one hand reaching out to grab the saddle horn, but Jake wasn't done. The coward in him knew that if McKinnon recovered, if the rancher got his bearings and turned around to face him, Jake would be finished. So he struck again, this time catching McKinnon in the side of the head with a wild swing that sent the older man crashing to the wooden sidewalk. The sound of McKinnon hitting the ground seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon air. The rancher tried to push himself up, shaking his head grudgingly, blood beginning to show at the corner of his mouth. His hat had fallen off, and his usually neat hair was now disheveled and dusty. What are you doing?" McKinnon managed to gasp, looking up at Jake with confusion rather than anger. Even now, even after being attacked, the rancher seemed more bewildered than hostile. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't answer. The shame of what he was doing threatened to choke him, but desperation drove him forward. He dropped to his knees beside the fallen rancher and began rifling through McKinnon's pockets, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage to grab hold of anything. "Please," McKinnon said weakly, trying to push Jake's hands away. "I have a family. That money, it's for my ranch, my workers." But Jake had found what he was looking for. The thick roll of bills came free from McKinnon's vest pocket, and Jake clutched it to his chest like a drowning man grabbing a rope. $200. More money than he'd seen in months. By now, people had started to notice the commotion. A woman across the street stopped sweeping her porch and stared. Two men coming out of the general store began walking quickly toward the scene. Someone shouted something that Jake couldn't make out over the roaring in his ears. Jake scrambled to his feet, the stolen money still clutched in his hand. McKinnon was trying to sit up, one hand pressed to his bleeding head, his eyes unfocused and confused. The sight of what he'd done to this kind, decent man should have stopped Jake cold. Instead, it spurred him to move faster. "Help, McKinnon," called out weakly to the approaching townspeople. "Stop him, .. But Jake was already moving. He vaulted onto his horse with the desperate agility of a man running for his life. The animal, sensing his panic, reared slightly before settling into a nervous prance. Jake could see more people emerging from buildings now, drawn by the commotion and McKinnon's calls for help. "Stop right there," shouted one of the men from the general store, but Jake was already spurring his horse into motion. The stolen money burned in his pocket as he rode hard toward the edge of town, leaving behind the scene of his cowardly crime and the injured rancher who'd shown him nothing but kindness. The McKinnon ranch stretched out like a small kingdom under the late afternoon sun. 15 miles from Deadwood Creek, it was the kind of spread that took a lifetime to build and generations to maintain. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle extended, as far as the eye could see, broken up by sturdy wooden fences and the occasional cluster of oak trees that provided shade for both animals and men during the hottest parts of the day. Thomas McKinnon stood on the front porch of the main house, a substantial two-story structure built from timber and stone that his father had hauled from the mountains 20 years earlier. At 35, Thomas had the same broad shoulders as his father, but where Samuel McKinnon had developed the patient wisdom that came with age, Thomas still carried the intensity of a man in his prime. His dark hair showed no gray yet, and his hands, while calloused from years of ranch work, moved with the quick precision of someone who'd never lost a step to age or complacency. The ranch was busy with the usual late-day activities. Cowboys were bringing in horses from the far pastures, and the sound of their calls and laughter carried across the open spaces. The smell of dust, leather, and livestock mixed with the aroma of dinner cooking in the bunkhouse kitchen. It was the kind of scene that played out every day at the McKinnon Ranch, a rhythm of work and routine that had been established over decades of successful operation. Thomas was reviewing the day's work with his foreman, Charlie Watts, a grizzled veteran who'd been working McKinnon land since before Thomas was old enough to sit a horse properly. Charlie had taught Thomas everything from roping cattle to reading weather signs, and the two men had developed the kind of easy working relationship that made the ranch run like a well-oiled machine. "The north pasture fence is going to need attention before winter sets in," Charlie was saying, pointing toward a distant section of the property. "Some of the posts are starting to lean, and we don't want any cattle wandering off when the snow gets deep." Thomas nodded, making a mental note to assign a crew to the repairs. This was the kind of detail work that separated successful ranches from failed ones, and Thomas had learned from his father that taking care of small problems prevented them from becoming big disasters. "How many men do you think we'll need for the job?" Thomas asked, leaning against the porch railing. "3 good men with tools should handle it in a couple of days," Charlie replied. "Maybe 4 if the ground's harder than it looks." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Both men turned to see a rider coming hard across the open ground, his horse lathered with sweat and moving with the desperate urgency that usually meant trouble. The rider was Billy Thompson, a young cowboy who worked in town at the livery stable. Thomas knew him well enough to know that Billy wouldn't ride 15 miles at that pace unless something serious had happened. Billy pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the porch, the animal breathing heavily and foam showing around its mouth. The young cowboy's face was flushed and worried, and he was looking directly at Thomas with the kind of expression that made a man's stomach tighten with dread. "Mr. Thomas?" Billy called out, swinging down from his saddle before his horse had even come to a complete stop. "You need to know about your father. Something terrible has happened." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stepped down from the porch, Charlie right beside him, both men moving with the quick alertness of people who'd spent their lives dealing with emergencies. On a ranch, bad news usually meant someone was hurt, and hurt could mean anything from a broken bone to something much worse. "What happened to him?" Thomas demanded, his voice already taking on the hard edge that people who knew him learned to recognize and respect. Is he hurt? Billy nodded, still breathing hard from his ride. Yes, sir, he's hurt pretty bad. Some drifter attacked him right there in town, broad daylight, right outside the bank. Hit him from behind like a coward, knocked him down and robbed him of all that money from the cattle sale. For a moment, Thomas didn't respond. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and Thomas felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. His father, Samuel McKinnon, was one of the most respected men in 3 counties. He was known for his fairness, his generosity, and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. The idea that someone would attack him, especially from behind, was almost impossible to process. How bad is he hurt? Thomas asked, his voice deadly quiet now. Doc Peterson is with him now, Billy continued. Your father was conscious when I left, but he's got a bad cut on his head and his jaw might be broken. He was having trouble talking and there was blood ... Billy's voice trailed off, but Thomas could fill in the details. Charlie stepped forward, his weathered face showing the same cold anger that was building in Thomas. Did anyone see who did it? Can they describe the man? Yes, sir, Billy nodded. Several folks saw the whole thing. Drifter named Jake Morrison, goes by Yellow Jake, on account of his reputation. Skinny fellow with shifty eyes, riding a tired-looking brown horse. He asked your father for work, and when Mr. Samuel was trying to help him find employment elsewhere, the coward sucker punched him and took the money. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. The image of his kind, generous father being attacked by some desperate criminal made his vision go red around the edges. Samuel McKinnon had built his reputation on treating people fairly, paying his debts, and helping his neighbors. For someone to repay that kindness with violence was more than Thomas could stand. Which way did he go? Thomas asked, his voice still quiet but carrying a tone that made both Billy and Charlie take a step back. He rode out toward the Badlands. Heading west, Billy replied. But Mr. Thomas, that was more than an hour ago. He could be anywhere by now. Thomas was already moving, striding toward the barn with the purposeful gait of a man who'd made a decision. Charlie fell into step beside him, and Billy hurried to keep up, still leading his exhausted horse. Charlie, Thomas said without slowing down, I want you to saddle Storm and load my rifle. Then I want you to send riders to every ranch, camp, and watering hole within 50 miles. Tell them Thomas McKinnon is calling in favors and I need every hard man who owes me loyalty to meet here within 3 hours. Charlie nodded grimly. He'd known Thomas since the younger man was barely old enough to hold reins, and he'd never seen this particular look in his eyes before. It was the cold, calculating fury of a man who'd been pushed too far and was preparing to push back twice. As hard. What about your father? Billy asked. Shouldn't you go to town to see him? Thomas paused at the barn door and turned to face the young cowboy. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed by argument or reason. My father has the best doctor in the territory taking care of him, and half the town watching over him. What he needs from me isn't bedside comfort. What he needs is justice, and that's exactly what he's going to get. The sun was starting to sink lower in the western sky, painting the ranch buildings with long shadows. In the distance, cattle were settling down for the evening, and the normal sounds of ranch life continued. But Thomas McKinnon was no longer thinking about fences or cattle or the routine work of running a successful ranch. He was thinking about 50 of the hardest, toughest, most loyal cowboys he'd ever known and how they were going to help him. Teach Jake Morrison that some men you just don't cross. The kind of lesson that would be remembered for years to come, told around campfires and in saloons as a warning to anyone who thought they could prey on decent folk and ride away unpunished. The reckoning was coming, and Thomas McKinnon was going to make sure it was one that Jake Morrison would never forget. The first riders arrived just as the sun was touching the western horizon. Thomas heard them before he saw them, the sound of multiple horses moving at a steady pace across the open grassland. He stepped out of the barn where he'd been checking his rifle and saw a group of 5 cowboys approaching. Led by Rusty Coleman from the Bartee Ranch 20 miles south, Rusty was exactly the kind of man Thomas had been hoping would answer his call. He was a lean, hard-faced cowboy in his 40s, who'd survived more range wars and cattle drives than most men twice his age. His reputation for loyalty was matched only by his reputation for being absolutely fearless in a fight. When Rusty heard that someone had attacked Samuel McKinnon, his weathered face had gone dark as a thundercloud. "Thomas," Rusty called out. As he dismounted, "Billy Thompson rode through and told us what happened to your father. We came as soon as we could get saddled up." "I appreciate it, Rusty," Thomas replied, shaking the older cowboy's hand. "How's your father doing, and do we know anything more about this yellow dog who attacked him?" "Last word I got, the DOC says your father's going to be fine, but he's pretty shaken up. As for the man who did it, folks in town are calling him Yellow Jake Morrison. Apparently he's been drifting through these parts for months, picking up odd jobs and causing small troubles wherever he goes." Behind Rusty, the other cowboys were dismounting and checking their weapons. Thomas recognized most of them. Hard. Men who'd worked cattle in all kinds of weather and weren't afraid of anything that walked on 2 legs or 4. These were the kind of cowboys who'd stand with you in a stampede or a gunfight and never ask questions about the odds. Within the next hour, more riders began arriving in groups of 3 and 4. Word had spread quickly through the network of ranches, line camps, and watering holes that dotted the territory. The message was simple: Thomas McKinnon needed help, and any man who'd ever been treated fairly by the McKinnon family was expected to respond. And they did respond. Cowboys came from ranches 30 miles away, leaving their own work to answer Thomas's call. Some were young men looking to prove themselves, but most were seasoned veterans who understood that what had happened to Samuel McKinnon was the kind of thing that could happen to any decent man if cowards like Jake Morrison were allowed to get away with their crimes. Among the arrivals was Iron Pete Rodriguez, a Mexican-American cowboy whose skills with a rope were legendary throughout the territory. Pete had worked for Samuel McKinnon during his younger days, and the old rancher had treated him like family when other employers had treated him poorly because of his heritage. When Pete heard what had happened, he'd ridden 25 miles without stopping to change horses. "Mr. Thomas," Pete said as he approached the main house, his accent thick with emotion, "your father, he gave me my first real job when nobody else would hire a Mexican boy. I owe him everything I got today. You tell me what you need, and I'll do it." Thomas clapped the smaller man on the shoulder. "I know he thinks highly of you too, Pete, and right now, what I need is 50 men who aren't afraid of a hard ride and maybe a harder fight." By the time full darkness had fallen, Thomas had more than 50 men assembled in front of his ranch house. They came from all walks of cowboy life. Some were ranch hands. Others were independent operators who worked cattle drives between ranches. A few were former lawmen who'd traded badges for lassos, and several were veterans of the Indian Wars who'd settled down to the quieter life of ranch work, but they all had one thing in common. They were tough, experienced men who understood the code of the frontier. When a good man was attacked by a coward, decent folks had to stand up and make things right. Otherwise, the cowards would multiply like rats, and no honest person would be safe. Thomas stood on his front porch, looking out at the assembled riders. Their faces were lit by torches and lanterns, creating dancing shadows that made them look even harder and more determined than they already were. These weren't men who'd been hired for money. They'd come because Thomas McKinnon had asked, and because they all knew what kind of man his father was. "I want to thank you all for coming," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Most of you know what happened to my father today. A drifting coward named Jake Morrison attacked him from behind, robbed him, and rode off, thinking he'd gotten away with it." A murmur of anger ran through the assembled cowboys. Several men spat in the dust, and Thomas could see hands resting on gun butts. These weren't men who had much patience for cowards or back shooters. "Now, my father's going to be fine," Thomas continued. "Doc Peterson says he'll recover completely, though it'll take some time. But that's not the point. The point is that Jake Morrison thought he could prey on a decent man and ride away without consequences. We're here to show him that he was wrong." "What's the plan, Thomas?" called out Red Murphy from the Lazy S Ranch. Red was a giant of a man with flaming red hair and a temper to match, but he was also smart enough to know that 50 men needed organization if they were going to be effective. Billy Thompson says Morrison rode west toward the Badlands, Thomas replied. That's rough country with lots of places to hide, but there's only a few water sources. We're going to split into groups and check every creek, every spring, and every watering hole between here and the border. When we find him, and we will find him, he's going to learn that there are consequences for attacking good people. Charlie. Watts stepped forward, carrying Thomas's rifle and saddlebags. The old foreman had been quietly organizing supplies while Thomas addressed the men. I've got extra ammunition and supplies loaded, he said. Food for 2 days and grain for the horses. If this Morrison fellow thinks he can outlast us in the Badlands, he's got another thing coming. The preparation continued for another hour. Men checked their weapons, loaded their saddlebags, and made sure their horses were ready for what might be a long, hard chase. Several of the cowboys had brought spare horses, knowing that they might need to change mounts during the pursuit. As they worked, stories began to circulate about Jake Morrison. It turned out that several of the assembled cowboys had encountered him during his drifting, and none of the encounters had been pleasant. He'd been run out of 2 towns for cheating at cards, had been caught trying to steal a horse in another place, and had a reputation for picking fights with smaller men while avoiding anyone who might be able to handle him. He's yellow clear. Through, observed Tex Harrison, a cowboy from the northern ranges. The kind of man who'll steal from you while shaking your hand, then run like a rabbit when someone calls him on it. Well, he's done his last running, Thomas said grimly. By the time we're finished with him, Jake Morrison is going to wish. He'd never heard the name McKinnon. As midnight approached, Thomas mounted his horse, a powerful black stallion named Storm that had been his companion for 7 years. The animal seemed to sense the serious nature of what was about to happen, stamping its hooves and tossing its head with nervous energy. Let's ride, Thomas called out, and 53 horses moved out into the darkness. They rode hard through the night, following old cattle trails and deer paths that led toward the Badlands. Thomas had grown up in this country and knew every ridge, every valley, and every water source for 50 miles in any direction. If Jake Morrison was hiding somewhere in this wilderness, Thomas and his men would find him. The moon was bright enough to light their way, and the experienced cowboys had no trouble following Thomas's lead through the rough terrain. They moved, like a well-organized army, splitting into smaller groups to cover more ground, but staying within signaling distance of each other. As dawn began to break over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas called. A halt near a small creek that ran through a grove of cottonwood trees. It was the kind of place where a man on the run might stop to rest his horse and refill his water bottles, and that's exactly where they found Jake Morrison. Sleeping beside the cold ashes of a small campfire, the stolen money still clutched in his hand even in sleep. Jake Morrison woke to the sound of leather creaking and horses snorting softly in the morning air. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought he might be dreaming. But as his eyes focused and his mind cleared, he realized that his worst nightmare had just become reality. 53. Armed cowboys sat their horses in a perfect circle around his small campsite. They were close enough that Jake could see the grim determination in their faces, but far enough away that any thoughts of running or fighting were clearly hopeless. The morning sun, just climbing over the eastern ridges, cast long shadows that made the mounted men look even more imposing than they already were. In the center of the circle, directly in front of Jake, sat Thomas McKinnon on his black stallion. Even if Jake had never seen him before, he would have known this was someone important just by the way the other cowboys deferred to him. Thomas sat easy in his saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, the other holding his reins with the casual confidence of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Jake scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The stolen money, which he'd been clutching even in sleep, scattered on the ground around him. Bills fluttered in the morning breeze like autumn leaves. The very money he'd thought would solve all his problems now seeming like the most worthless thing in the world. "Good morning, Jake," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." The words were spoken calmly, almost conversationally, but there was something underneath them that made Jake's blood run cold. This wasn't the hot anger of a man who'd lost his temper. This was the cold, calculated fury of someone who'd had all night to think about what he was going to do. "Look, mister," Jake began, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a traveling cowboy looking for work." Several of the mounted men made sounds of disgust, and Jake could see heads shaking in the circle around him. These weren't men who had any patience for lies, especially obvious ones. "Jake Morrison," Thomas continued, still in that same calm voice, "also known as Yellow Jake. Yesterday afternoon you approached my father, Samuel McKinnon, outside the bank in Deadwood Creek. He tried to help you find work, and you repaid his kindness by attacking him from behind like the coward you are." Jake's mouth went dry. He looked around the circle of hard faces, searching for even a hint of sympathy or mercy, but finding none. These weren't lawmen who might be bound by rules and procedures. These were frontier cowboys operating by their own code of justice. And Jake was beginning to understand just how serious his situation had become. "Your father," Jake said desperately. "Is he? Is he all right?" "He's going to recover," Thomas replied. "But that's not thanks to you. Doc Peterson says his jaw might be broken, and he's got a concussion from where you hit him. All for $200 that you didn't earn and didn't deserve." As if to emphasize the point, Iron Pete Rodriguez dismounted and began gathering up the scattered bills. He counted them carefully, making sure every dollar was accounted for, then walked over to hand the money to Thomas. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, the stolen money returning to the McKinnon family, while Jake stood empty-handed and surrounded. "Now," Thomas continued, "I could turn you over to the sheriff in Deadwood Creek. You'd probably get a few years in prison, maybe more if the judge was having a bad day. But prison's too easy for someone like you. Prison feeds you, gives you a roof, keeps you warm in winter. That's more than you deserve." Jake felt his knees go weak. Prison was starting to sound like a pretty good option compared to whatever these 50-plus cowboys had in mind. He'd heard stories about frontier justice, about what happened to men who crossed the wrong people in this part of the country. Most of those stories didn't end well for the man who'd done the crossing. "Please," Jake begged, all pretense of toughness finally abandoning him completely. "I'll do anything. I'll work for free, I'll pay back every cent with interest, I'll leave the territory and never come back." "Oh, you'll leave the territory," Thomas agreed, "but not the way you came. Charlie, bring me that iron." Charlie Watts rode forward, pulling something from his saddlebags. It was a branding iron, the kind used to mark cattle, but smaller. Jake couldn't see what letter or symbol it was shaped like, but the sight of it made his stomach clench with terror. "The way I see it," Thomas explained, "you've got two choices, Jake. You can face me in a fair fight. Guns or fists, winner takes all. If you win, you keep the money and ride away. If I win, well, then we do things my way." Jake looked around the circle again. Thomas McKinnon was clearly in his prime, a man who'd spent his life doing physical work and handling trouble. Jake knew he wouldn't last 30 seconds against him in any kind of fair fight. "Or," Thomas continued, "you can accept your punishment like the coward you are, and maybe walk away with your life." The choice wasn't really a choice at all, and everyone present knew it. Jake might be many things, but he wasn't completely stupid. Fighting Thomas would just mean getting beaten up before facing whatever punishment the Cowboys had planned anyway. I'll take the punishment," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. What followed was the most humiliating experience of Jake Morrison's life. The Cowboys stripped him of his gun belt, his boots, and his horse. They branded him with a C for coward, a mark he would carry for the rest of his life as a reminder of what he'd done and what he'd become. It wasn't a large brand, just big enough to be visible when he was shirtless. But it was permanent. But the physical marking was nothing compared to the psychological punishment. 53 of the toughest cowboys in the territory had seen him break down, seen him beg for mercy, seen him reduced to something less than a man. Word would spread throughout the territory and beyond about what had happened to Jake Morrison when he crossed the McKinnon family. "You've got until sunset to get out of this territory," Thomas told him as the Cowboys prepared to leave. "If anyone sees you around here after that, they'll know you for what you are, and they'll treat you accordingly?" Jake nodded frantically, still holding his shirt against the fresh brand mark. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll leave. I won't come back, I promise." "See that you don't," Thomas replied. "Because if you ever even think about coming back, if you ever consider hurting another innocent person, remember this morning. Remember that there are men in this world who won't let cowards like you prey on decent folk." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, 53 cowboys mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Jake Morrison alone in the wilderness with nothing but his pants and his shame. He had no horse, no boots, no gun, and no money. More importantly, he had no reputation left to speak of. The story of Yellow Jake Morrison and his encounter with Thomas McKinnon's Justice Riders spread throughout the territory like wildfire. It became the kind of tale that cowboys told around campfires and bartenders shared with customers. It served as a warning to other would-be predators and as a reminder that in the frontier, actions had consequences. Samuel McKinnon recovered fully from his injuries, and the stolen money was returned to him intact. But more than that, the reputation of the McKinnon family was enhanced. People knew that the McKinnons were not only fair and generous, but that they were also not to be trifled with. As for Jake Morrison, he was never seen in the territory again. Some say he made it to California and tried to start over under a different name. Others claim he headed east, back to the civilized parts of the country where cowards could hide among crowds of strangers. But wherever he went, he carried that brand with him, and the memory of the morning when 53 cowboys taught him that some men you just don't cross. The frontier was a hard place, but it was also a fair one, where good men stood together and cowards learned the price of their choices.